Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to another one of my 11 videos. That is my videos in which I list 11 books. This is going to be a good deal over 11 books because in honor of Black History Month I wanted to make a list of modern classics written by Black American authors. Modern in this context means published after 1900. And I chose to focus on American authors because I wanted to have this list of books reflect the Black experience here in the United States of America, which is different than the Black experience in other places, as many of these books highlight. I chose the books on this list in part because they are all, I think, amazing classic works of American literature. But I also chose them because I think they also tell the story of the Black experience in the United States of America and of the concerns of Black authors at various points in American history. So I'm actually listing the books chronologically. This isn't a ranked list of best, my top 10 or something like that. But I'm listing the books chronologically because I think if we think about them chronologically, we can see the connections, and we can better see the connections and how they communicate with one another across time. And I think that's important. Now, having said that, it is not the responsibility of any Black author of fiction to educate anyone on anything. It's not their responsibility to make their books teaching tools to teach people like me, white people, about the Black experience, nor do I imagine that just because I've read these books, I understand the Black experience in the United States of America. I don't. But these books offer some insight into that, I think. And if you think about them as that, in that way, that's why sometimes I've chosen certain books by authors and not others. It's not that I don't think that all the novels of James Baldwin I've read are excellent. I do. It's not that I don't think that almost all the novels of Toni Morrison I've read are not excellent to very good. I do. I pick these novels because of what I think they say about the history of the Black experience in the United States of America, and I thought that would make a good subject for this video, considering that it's Black History Month. So, number one on the list is the collective poems of Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was one of the most important Black writers of the Harlem Renaissance period. He wrote poetry, he wrote short stories, he was a kind of a known figure and leader and kind of one of the original people that we associate with that time period. And I think his poems are particularly important and particularly amazing in the context of this list of works I'm talking about, because you can find almost everything in his poetry, in his poems. They're funny, they are atmospheric about the time and place they were created. They can be angry, they can be powerful, they can be sad. His poetry is really amazing. So one of the things I think that'd be great is, if you wanted to get into Langston Hughes' poetry, is to buy like the collected works of Langston Hughes and kind of read the poems chronologically. By the way, Caitlin Bandy from Bandy's Books had this exact book of poetry, and the collected poems or poetry of Langston Hughes on her Black History Month TBR, and in the video she made answering the Black History Month tag. So I wanted to make sure I shouted that out because that was a nice reminder to me to put Langston Hughes on this list. Number two, I have Cain by Jean Toomer. This is a modern classic in both senses. By the way, I didn't define this earlier, but for my definition, modern is a book published after 1900. But this is actually a modernist book in that it blends different forms of fiction together. There's poetry, there's kind of like prose poetry, there's straight out storytelling. And in this book, Jean Toomer, who was a Black writer, even though for Toomer, he tried to kind of dismiss the idea that his race was important necessarily to his books. In Cain, he explores kind of, I think, the Black experience living in the South in all kinds of ways. And there's a lot of focus on sexual relationships. There's a lot of focus on economic relationships and social relationships between different classes of Black Americans. And it really is a challenging and yet I think really remarkable book. And I believe Crypto and Una over at the Codex Cantina have been doing readings and analyzing sections of Cain on their channel. I'll leave a link to their channel and Caitlin's channel and hopefully all the channels I mentioned in this video down below. So you could go check that out if you're interested in Cain. At number 3, I have Their Eyes Were Watching God. By the way, this is not a ranking. I'm just listing the book. Sorry. The third book on my list is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. This is just a remarkable work telling the story of Janie and her experiences with men and marriage and living in black communities in the South and in Florida, and their experience with a hurricane and tragedies that ensued. And what we get from it is we get this kind of portrait or picture of these black communities in the South during the 1920s and 30s. And we also get this amazing character in Janie, who is a very independent-minded woman and who in the end realizes that her happiness is something that she's responsible for, and her happiness and contentment is something that she can provide herself. It's just a remarkable, I think, work in lots of ways. Karen over at Run Right Reads, I believe, is doing a read-along of Their Eyes Were Watching God this month, so I'll leave a link to her channel as well. Next on my list is Native Son by Richard Wright. Incredible, powerful, searing, it's sometimes controversial story of a young black man named Bigger Thomas who finds his way into all kinds of trouble. I don't want to give too much away, even though I think most of this is pretty well known. He commits an act of violence against a white woman, and he then is on the run for his life. And his life then spirals out of control. And what Wright really looks for here, he doesn't forgive, he doesn't excuse Bigger Thomas's crimes. What he really is exposing is the circumstances in which Bigger Thomas lives and finds himself, and the way the world looks at him before he does anything wrong, and then the way the world looks at him after he does things wrong, and how all these different forces are at play. It's a remarkable novel and a fairly searing and memorable one. The next book on my list is Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. This really is a true masterpiece. It's a really, I think, kind of a challenging book to read. We follow an unnamed narrator who, when we pick up the story, he's essentially living underground in a place that is lit by lots of light bulbs, and he's kind of more or less sealed himself in. And essentially what the book explores is the anonymity, the invisibleness of being a black man, and the ways in which black people compete with one another, and the ways in which black people are forced to adapt to society. He becomes kind of a faceless college student who, whenever he does something which makes him stand out, is punished. He goes to New York to attempt to find a job, and he finds out that he has been kind of hamstrung by the people he thought were trying to help him. He goes to work in a factory making, of all things, white paint, obviously symbolism there, and he has problems there. He gets involved in political and social and protest movements, and that doesn't work out. He becomes, he is a student, he is a laborer, he is a protest leader, he's all these things, but he's never just a human being. And I think that's kind of what Ellison's exploring here, and it is a remarkable and powerful novel. At number 6, nobody's going to be surprised that I kind of again cheated here, and I have 2 novels at number 6. The first one is Go Tell It on the Mountain by James Baldwin. This is Baldwin's first novel, and it kind of explores it's somewhat autobiographical, explores his experience as a young man, as a young gay man, growing up in Harlem and trying to find his way, navigate his way between the racist white police structure society and a violent, abusive father, and learning about his past and coming to grips with who he is. It is really powerful, and it gives a great sense of place and time and history. But I also wanted to throw a second James Baldwin novel in here, and that is If Beale Street Could Talk, which I believe was published in 1972, which tells the story of a young African-American couple who fall in love, and then racism and police violence and kind of destroys all that and puts tremendous pressure on their family and on their relationship. Also a really remarkable novel. I think fits really well within this kind of context of this list I put together, showing this kind of evolution of what black writers were writing about, what they were concerned about, what the issues of the day were. At number 7, I have Kindred by Octavia Butler. This is a well-loved book here on BookTube. which lots of people read. Butler is, I think, one of the originators of Afrofuturism, and in this novel we see a young woman who is, inexplicably transported back to the past in Maryland in the kind of antebellum period. I believe it's really kind of early on in the 18-teens, 1820s, where she is kind of forced to save a young white man, boy, over and over again, and to live her life as a slave while she's trapped there. And it gives kind of, I think it really kind of hits all the issues that oftentimes we overlook about the experience of being enslaved and having no control, and yet being tied to the white world in ways in which you don't want to be connected. It's really powerful, and I think it's a really great book. My next book is one that I just finished, and to my shame, it's a book that I had not read for, what are we going on now, almost 50 years, and that's The Color Purple by Alice Walker. I just finished it, and I found it to be far more than I ever thought it was going to be. It's an epistolatory novel. It's written in the form of letters from Celie to God, and then from Celie to her sister, and then from Celie's sister to her. And there's so much more here than what I thought. So I knew, I've never seen the movie either, I knew going in that this was the story of a black woman who is in an abusive relationship and whose life is kind of miserable, not kind of, is miserable in lots of ways. And I knew that it was in some ways a story about the connections between black women in all kinds of ways. But I didn't really realize that this is essentially a black woman's novel talking about the problems faced by black women in the early part of the 20th century, but that still in many ways carry over. The likelihood that they're going to be victims of violence, the necessity of them bonding and banding together. It has a sense of humor, it has great characters, and it has this whole other aspect to it that I didn't know was there, which is essentially Walker, through Celie's sister, looking at the differences and the prejudices on each side of black Americans who went to Africa as missionaries or for whatever reason, and the communities of African people, and how they saw one another and how they related to one another. And it kind of then highlights the uniqueness of the black experience in the United States of America. But I found it to be really remarkable, and so I put it on my list. Again, nobody's going to be surprised that I have two novels by Toni Morrison on my list. Again, cheating. The first is Beloved, which is I just think the greatest American novel ever, which really brings home the legacy, well, the horror of slavery and the legacy of slavery in an incredibly powerful, oftentimes difficult to read, incredibly memorable way that is just beautifully written. I just think, I'm not going to talk about it too long here, I just think it's a really great novel, which I wish everyone would read. Even if you end up thinking that my opinion is inflated, I still think everybody should read it. But Jack the Rambling Raconteur at one point pointed out to me, and I believe he's mentioned on this channel, that in 2008, Toni Morrison wrote a novel called A Mercy, which explores a lot of the same issues. It's not as good as Beloved, but it explores a lot of the same issues and ideas that are explored in Beloved are explored in A Mercy. And A Mercy is a little bit more, the novel A Mercy is a little bit more straightforward in its storytelling, but does cover a lot of the same themes. The next novel on my list is The Known World by Edward P. Jones. This is just an incredibly great novel that, oftentimes I think gets overlooked, in part because Jones produced books of short stories after that, but he didn't go on to write another great novel, at least as far as I know, or at least as far as critics have informed me. But The Known World is remarkable. In The Known World, Jones looks at slavery in Virginia, and he focuses on a family whose last name is Thomas. The father's name is Augustus, I believe the son's name is Henry. And Augustus Thomas, the father, lives on a plantation. He's able to purchase his own freedom and the freedom then of his family, and lives as a free black person in Virginia in the years before the Civil War. His son Henry then has all the benefits, not all the benefits, has the benefits of that, and Henry goes on to acquire land and amass wealth, and ultimately Henry begins to purchase slaves. So the novel focuses on this kind of the tiers of race relations among black people in the South, and how that related to white Southern society during the time period. And essentially, you know, if you look at the title, The Known World, Henry is operating within the world he knew. And in the world he knew, wealthy, successful people bought slaves. And so Henry does that, even though even though it really hurts his father. And even though it leads to tragedy. Sorry, the dog's interrupted my train of thought. Anyway, it explores in an incredibly brilliant way, I think, all the layers and all the different kinds of race-related issues that exist here, and it tells, even though not in a linear way, and even though not necessarily a complete way, it tells a really powerful story, and I just think it's great. I think at one time it was Sean the Book Maniac's favorite novel. The next book on my list is a book that I just purchased. It just is being delivered to my house probably tomorrow, and that's the collected poetry of Nikki Giovanni. Nikki Giovanni, one of my favorite American poets, one of the most impressive people I think so many people have not heard about. She wrote great poetry in the 1960s and 1970s, focusing oftentimes, most of the time, on the black experience in the United States during her lifetime. She is an incredibly fierce and powerful person, and her poetry reflects that. She's also a person with a great sense of humor and a powerful sense of family, and her poetry reflects that. I've read her poems on my channel before, and I just think she's great. Somebody like put me on to a series of discussions between she and James Baldwin, which she more than holds her own with James Baldwin. If you've ever seen a James Baldwin interview, you know that is quite the statement to make. And she's just remarkable, and I really love her poems. You know, I don't know that I love every poem by any poet, but Nikki Giovanni is really close on that list. The next book on my list is The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. Colson Whitehead has won, what, the Pulitzer, the National Book Award, something like that, 2 times in a row for Underground Railroad and then The Nickel Boys. Underground Railroad is essentially a story of the black experience in the United States from slavery up through the 20th century. And it's told with this kind of magical realist, and I hate to say that because so many of you are not going to read it because of that. Please get over yourself and read this book if you haven't. In which the Underground Railroad is an actual railroad that carries its main characters essentially from one point in the black experience in the United States to another. There is graphic violence, there is racism shown in all kinds of different faces and phases in the United States of America. You shouldn't take it as an actual history, but more as referencing and connecting to history of the black experience in the United States of America. And I just think it's great. And I think it was published the same year as Lincoln and the Bardo by George Saunders, and I think Saunders won most of the awards. But for my money, Underground Railroad is better. The next book on my list is Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward. This book explores or follows a child and his kind of incredibly dysfunctional family with a grandfather who he loves but has a secret, a mother who has substance abuse problems and is oftentimes absent, a grandmother who is dying, and essentially the ghost of regrets following the family around. And again, I know since I mentioned ghosts, many of you are going to think, oh, well, this isn't for me. I promise you it is. It's possible that Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward is a better novel. It certainly is, I think, more beautiful in some ways, but this one I think kind of fits the list I made here, which I think is more about the ways in which American society affect the black community, affect black people in the United States of America. And the last book on my list here is The Trees by Percival Everett, which just published in 2022, was up for all kinds of awards. It is a satire beginning with in the community in which Emmett Till was murdered, and there's a series of violent murders of white people in that community. Two black police officers from the Georgia Bureau of Investigations go there to investigate. They face racism and prejudice, and good old boys, you need to keep in mind that it's satire, and everything about it means that things are over the top. The violence is over the top. The naming of characters is over the top. The stereotyping, the racial stereotyping is over the top, and it ends up kind of with this incredibly powerful message that reminds us of all the people in the United States, black and other people of color, who have died as victims of racist violence in the United States. And in that respect, it's kind of also like an imaginary revenge story. But I just thought it was great. It was my book of the year, my favorite fiction book of the year in 2022. Anyway, there you go. There's my 11-ish list of modern classics written by modern American classics written by black authors. If I left authors out, please let me know in the comment section down below. It's possible I left them out because I still haven't read them yet, but I would be interested in seeing books and authors you think belong on this list. As always, I look forward to your comments, and thank you for watching.